Ambient occlusion and screen space ambient occlusion. Occlusion is a fancy word for obstruction or blocking. This is a photograph of a box I have propped up on a white card out in the noonday sunlight. This whole scene is illuminated just by sunlight, but this box is blocking the sunlight from the area of the card underneath it. And so we have this very distinct shadow. This is a very simple case of occlusion in action. The sun is a very distant single point source of light. Here is the same arrangement, but I have moved it closer to the wall of my house so that the sun is no longer shining on it. Now you may say, hey, wait a second. If the sun isn't shining on this, why isn't it all as dark as underneath the box here where the sun can't reach? The reason is that we have ambient illumination at work. Ambient illumination is the term we use for all of the light from the environment. And in this case, there is sky all above and all around this scene. The sky is our atmosphere, and it is made of dust and molecules, and the sun is shining on those too, and those are all reflecting little bits of light in all possible directions, and the result is that the sky is emitting light from all possible directions on this scene. This is a somewhat more complex case of occlusion than our first shot where the box was blocking light from just one direction. Now the box is blocking light from an infinite number of directions all around it. Now the box is blocking light from an infinite number of directions all around it. Here, underneath the box is blocking light from almost the entire sky, and so it is very dark under here. Here, farther, closer to the edge, the box is only blocking light from about half the sky, and so this is somewhat brighter. And as we get farther away from the box is blocking almost none of the light from the sky. And so there is almost no occlusion happening around here at all. Notice that this is why we have this hazy shadow appearance as we move from directly under the box to outside of it. As we move from here, these points are gradually more and more exposed to more and more of the sky. So we have a very gradual transition from fully shaded to fully exposed to the environmental light. I should note that ambient illumination is not just the sky, it's everything that might be bouncing some light onto your scene. It might be rocks or trees or clouds or buildings that are nearby. Anything you can see around you is reflecting some light toward you. That's why you can see it. But the sky tends to be the brightest and strongest component of ambient illumination in these sorts of scenes. And I'll note that because the dust and molecules in the sky reflect primarily blue light, the light arriving on this scene from the ambient illumination is predominantly blue, unlike our scene that was illuminated predominantly by the sun. Now you may say, hey, wait a second, wasn't there also a blue sky out when you took this picture in the noonday sun? Yes, there was a blue sky out, and it is illuminating this scene with ambient illumination. We can see some of that blue light right here in this part of the shadow that is most exposed to the sky. This part of the shadow is bluer and brighter than this part of the shadow where the ground is not nearly as exposed to the sky. So ambient illumination is at work in this scene, but outside of this shadow, the sunlight is so much more stronger than the ambient illumination that we don't notice the ambient illumination where the sun is shining directly. But ambient illumination is at work, and the occlusion of the ambient illumination by the box is also at work here too. We can see that as we move from points far away from the box to under it, that the points are getting darker because the box is occluding more and more of that ambient illumination from the ground. So this is a somewhat more complicated example of occlusion than I first led on. It isn't really just the sunlight from one direction. There's a lot of sunlight from one direction and a certain amount of ambient light from all over. It is possible in Animation Master to create lights whose light rays are not stopped by objects in their path, and it is possible to create objects that don't stop light that lands upon them. The light just travels through to whatever is behind them. However, when an object doesn't cast a shadow, it's very unclear about where it is in relation to the ground. In general, we like to see shadows, whether they're sharp or whether they're fuzzy. Shadows tell us a lot about the relationship of an object to the ground, and we expect to see them there in most circumstances. Here is a more typical example of this circumstance at work. This is indoors, however, not outdoors. This is a Roman sarcophagus, and I think we can presume it is in a gallery somewhere with white walls on all four sides. And there must be some source of illumination in the room, but it's not shining directly on this object. Perhaps there's a skylight up at the ceiling, and that light is coming in and bouncing around all the walls and eventually landing on our art object here. We can see this has a very hazy shadow, just as in our example under the sky where we had a hazy shadow. The ambient illumination works in much the same way here, even though it's indoors rather than outdoors. We're getting an all-over lighting effect from the environment. Aside from a few ketchup stains over here, this is pretty much one chunk of white marble. It has all the same color, but the shading we see here is pretty much the result of the ambient light being occluded by the various nooks and crannies and shapes that are in this sculpture. Ambient occlusion, we would call it. For example, this centaur's chest is much more exposed to the all-around light than this little depression back here between his head and this piece of cloth. And so his chest is much more brightly lighted than this valley back here. Note that this is not the same as progressively shading things from light to dark from front to back. For example, this area right here is probably just as far back as this area right here between these two arms. But this one is more exposed to the surrounding light than this one buried back behind these two arms is. And so this area is lighter than this area back here. We typically call this soft lighting in layman's terms, and because it is pleasing and because it is very effective at revealing shapes with fine details, it's something we like to pursue in our Animation Master renderings for situations that merit it, like an indoor situation such as this.